I think it'll work. So have you been taking notes over Lent? Have you been paying attention to how all of the stories have ended? So we started with Jesus in the wilderness, in the desert, being tempted by the devil. There, 40 days, 40 nights, no food, no drink, no water, all by himself, resisting the temptations of the devil so that he could be honed and sharpened, so that he could begin his ministry, so that he would be ready for all the things that was about to happen to him. And then when he comes out of the wilderness, out of the desert, he goes to his hometown of Nazareth in Galilee. He goes to his home synagogue, and in his home synagogue, he's asked to pray, he's asked to read the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he takes it and he reads it, and it's the vision of God's peaceable kingdom, the coming of the messianic age, of how things that were up are going to be down, and things that are down are going to be up, that the hungry would be filled, the thirsty would have water, and everything was going to change. And he took that as his mantra and adopted Isaiah's vision as his own, and he went to go live it out throughout his mission and out his ministry. And he tells the people of his synagogue, if you don't get on board, this blessing that Isaiah is talking about might not be for you. And they get very upset with him, so much so that the story ends in Luke with Luke saying they were looking for a cliff to throw him off of. Now, luckily, there is no cliff in Nazareth, so he just sort of ran. Then he gets into these debates. 3 weeks in a row, we talked about debates with the Pharisees, his good friends, his colleagues, those who he could really wrestle with the word. These really are his peers. And he gets into these debates about the meaning of the Sabbath and the sanctity of the Sabbath, and which laws on the Sabbath ought to be adhered to and which ones could be pushed away for the greater good of the people. And each time the Pharisees get pretty upset with them for the point where it does say at one point they would like to punch him in the face. But getting upset to the point with someone that you would like to slap them across the face or punch them in the nose is not the same as what we heard Bob just read for us. This escalates pretty quick once Jesus gets to Jerusalem. Because when he was in Galilee, when he was in Nazareth, when he was in the rural areas of Judea, when he was just a good old rural country boy preaching the good news and healing people and doing miracles and feeding people and all that sort of, being a good preacher man, it was all fine and dandy. Sure, people got upset with him. Sure, they would like to throw him off a proverbial cliff and slap him across the face and punch him in the nose. But today, this preacher man, this rural backwoods preacher, makes his way into Jerusalem, and to quote the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, he is dangerous. Because today, Jesus really upsets the apple cart. Not that this should have caught anyone off guard. He said when he preached in his home synagogue and took the prophet Isaiah's scroll, he said, "This is what I am going to do." And if you didn't want to believe him, you could have believed his mother. Because way back in December, you remember then, right? You know, because he grew up so fast. Way back in December, when the angel Gabriel came to her and announced to Mary that she was going to give birth to the Son of God, she began to sing a song which we call the Magnificat. And this is what she said, and I quote, "He will bring down the powerful from their thrones. He will scatter the proud. He will lift up the lowly. He will fill the hungry with good things. And he will send the wealthy away empty." He is dangerous. Because when he is in the backwoods of Galilee and the rural areas and he's healing and he's preaching and he's teaching, that's all fine and dandy. But here in Jerusalem, he starts to take aim and target people right where it hurts. The wallet. He is starting to take money out of people's pocket. And if he came to take money out of yours, what would you do? He is dangerous. He came marching into Jerusalem, the scriptures tell us. And his Pharisees, his peers, his colleagues, those back in chapter 12 of the Gospel of Luke who had warned him that Herod was looking to kill him, that he should watch his back, they tell him, watch your crowd. They are making too much noise. Voices carry. And it could incite the Romans. Now, Marcus Borg, God rest his soul, rest in peace, Dr. Borg, he tells us in his wonderful book, The Last Week, that 25 years prior to the time that Jesus had entered into Jerusalem, there had been a riot in Jerusalem during the Passover festival because the Romans had got the bright idea that they should place the Roman eagle up on the arch of the temple in Jerusalem, and those who were empowered by and emboldened by the Passover festival and the story of God's liberation of the Hebrew children underneath the yoke of oppression from Egypt decide to take matters into their own hands, and the Romans squashed that rebellion, killing hundreds of festival goers. And since then, Rome had brought in extra troops into Jerusalem to be quote-unquote peacekeepers during the Passover festival. And so maybe the Pharisees have a point here. Jesus, shh. We don't need another riot. But he soon goes to the temple. And while he is at the temple, he could incite the crowds because he decides that one of the very first things he does when he gets to Jerusalem after walking in the festival of and during this procession with palms and singing and hosannas and everything is to go and to drive those who were selling the sacrificial animals, the doves and the lambs, so people could sacrifice it at the temple. He drives them away, calling them robbers, saying, "You are charging exorbitant prices," Dr. Borg says. And that could incite the crowd. Why was the dove that was only a month ago 2 all of a sudden 10? Where's that extra money going? Who's getting it? What are they doing with it? Have you ever started asking those type of questions to the people who ask money of you? And when you start asking those type of questions, do they like it? He is dangerous. Well, what does this have to do with us here? In Kensington, San Diego, California, the United States of America in the 21st century. He is not dangerous here. He is part of the status quo. He is part of our culture. I just listened to the wonderful Louis C.K. new comedy on Netflix, his stand-up special, and he makes this great point that Jesus is so a part of the American culture that every person in the world, and particularly here in the United States, tells time due to the Christian calendar. Whether you are Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, no faith whatsoever, he is so a part of our society and our culture that we tell time according to him. To the point where if you lived prior to his birth, all of a sudden you lived in negative years. That's how powerful Jesus is in our day and age. But he really isn't dangerous. Not to us. We don't get persecuted for our faith. So I want to ask you to place yourself within the story and ask yourself, where do you see yourself? Are you the Pharisees up on the walls telling his people to be quiet? Because you might incite a riot, Jesus, and that's no fun. Or are you part of the crowd shouting hosannas and asking questions of where that money is going? Are you waiting for the apple cart to get upset? But are you ready for what might be the repercussions of that? Or are you modeling your life like Christ's and actually doing a little bit of the upsetting? Because even though Jesus might not be dangerous and threatening in Kensington, California, San Diego, in the United States of America in the 21st century, in other places in the world, he's very dangerous. This past year, Pope Francis deified and made a saint the Most Reverend Blessed Oscar Romero, who was assassinated on March 24th, 1980, in a small chapel in a hospital in the capital of El Salvador. Oscar Romero was a champion of the poor, of the widows, of the orphans, and Romero rose through the ranks to the rank of archbishop. When he was an unknown priest in the rural areas of El Salvador preaching basic Catholic tenets of charity and compassion and nonviolence, the government really didn't pay much attention to Oscar Romero. And when he became head priest of a larger parish in the capital city, and he preached about the Sermon on the Mount and started soup kitchens and brought in the poor and the widow and the oppressed and started caring for them, and organized things to help children and mothers who have had their husbands kidnapped by soldiers, and families of men who had been assassinated and murdered by the government. Well, then they started to take a little bit of notice to him. But it wasn't until he became Archbishop of El Salvador and his influence and prestige reached the ranks of the Vatican in Rome itself that those in political positions of power in El Salvador truly began to pay attention to him. But he became dangerous when he called upon soldiers in the El Salvadorian army to call upon their higher calling as Christians and to no longer heed the charges and the commitments and the orders of their superiors that said that they need to hunt down and rape and kidnap women and kill children and assassinate men in the rural villages of El Salvador. And then when soldiers started to heed that call and disobey the government's orders, Romero became Christ-like in more ways than one. And on March 24th, as he finished his sermon in a chapel in a hospital, in a chapel filled with people surrounded who were sick and ailing and injured, who didn't have the health care that they deserved because of the corruption of the El Salvadorian government, a gunman hired by the El Salvadorian government broke into that chapel, and as he was consecrating the Eucharistic host, making the body of Christ present in their midst, he was shot dead. Nearly 50 years ago today, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral was held in two places, at Morehouse College and Ebenezer Baptist Church, because Dr. King had a dream that his faith called upon us to live in unity and peace. Nearly 40 years ago, the Most Reverend Blessed Oscar Romero was assassinated because he was called upon us to have a heart for the poor and for us to have a higher calling than our governmental and societal claims. Nearly 20 years ago, Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated because he believed his faith called Muslims and Jews to live together in the Holy Land of Israel and Jerusalem and Palestine. And women and men who have allowed their faith, their belief in God to guide them even when it was dangerous and to be Christ-like, they have been killed over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Some have made headlines and others have not. and not just people of faith, but people of goodwill, people who have stood up to authorities and those in power who would have us be silent or that we might upset the apple cart. First responders in 9/11 who gave their very hearts and body and minds and souls rushing into buildings those of us would not have the courage to do, have had their health care slashed in budget talks on Capitol Hill, even though the government promised them that we would take care of them. And people of goodwill and of faith have stood up and said, we will not let this corruption last. Marines and soldiers who have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, whose very lives were saved by interpreters, Arab and Muslim interpreters, so that because they believed that the U.S. military came to bring peace and prosperity to the Middle East and into Afghanistan. But when the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan and Iraq, they left those interpreters behind, even though the U.S. government promised them that they would be fast-tracked to the United States, them and their families. And Marines and soldiers have stood up to the Pentagon who have told them to be silent, and they said, no, we promise this. We deserve to go get them and bring them into safety. Doctors Without Borders go into violent and dangerous areas around the world every single day. They are in Syria right now taking care of the people who have died and who have been injured in that bombing, and people who have fought the horrible and insane persecution and destruction of the natural world, fighting governments who poach and destroy and kill beautiful animals of God's creation simply for money, game wardens and people of good faith and of goodwill to stand up to people who would kill giraffes and rhinos and silverback gorillas and chimpanzees and beautiful turtles and other areas and other pieces of the creation. They work tirelessly and they give up their lives when they have to. Palm Sunday begins with the waving of palms, and it's such a joyous occasion. But very quickly, sisters and brothers, the story gets dangerous. And the question I have for us this day is, will we let that dangerous story enter into our hearts and to convict us to be witnesses for Christ and stand in solidarity with those that this story is still very, very dangerous. He said to them, if only you would have known what it takes to make peace this day, may it be so. Amen.